So today we're going to continue in Mark 6, the feeding of the 5,000 and the walking on the sea miracle. At the end of the narrative, Mark is going to say something that indicates that he believes these two miracles somehow inform each other or interpret each other. And if you've followed along on this study so far, I think the themes that are being woven through could broadly be put under the category of divine warrior, this new Exodus motif. It's the idea that the people expected God to deliver them, just like he did at the Exodus. There's going to be this new Exodus. And these two narratives really back up that idea. In some extremely subtle ways, and in other ways, it's pretty on the nose. Now, we got a lot of ground to cover. We'll just note that this broader narrative, the feeding narrative, is neatly chiastic, as usual. But I'm actually going to start with a sidebar, which is a little bit odd. I haven't really been doing that. But rather than bring it up every time it comes up, I want to deal with it up front. And it's this article by Hugh Montefiore called Revolt in the Desert. And he's suggesting here that beneath Mark's narrative lies the trace of a suppressed uprising, similar to what is explicitly described in John 6. So in the conclusion of the feeding narrative in John's Gospel, verse 15, he says, "Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself." And so broadly speaking, the argument is that that is also what's going on in Mark. It's just not explicit. It's very implicit. Got to read between the lines. We'll look at that here in a moment. Note that narratively in Mark, John the Baptist has just been executed, and Jesus' reputation is now spreading. The crowds are likely seeking a new leader to continue the work John began. The outline of Montefiore's thesis can be summarized as follows. So here I give a very short summary. The block quote is going to be quotations from his article. So number one, coming and going in verse 31. He's arguing that these are preparations. It's not generic. He says, the phrase many were coming and going is mysterious. Who were the many? Why did they come and go? Their bustling activity could hardly refer to Jesus' teaching or healing. It is suggested that they were engaged in preparations for a messianic uprising. And in fact, the next point could kind of be taken together that the crowd's movement that they ran ahead in verse 33 is anticipation. If the multitude reached Jesus' rendezvous in front of Jesus, we must assume that their action was premeditated. This is confirmed by Mark's statement that people rushed together from every town. And there is actually quite a bit of discussion in the commentaries about some of this language, about the people running ahead, and even just questions about the verisimilitude of the story insofar as how is it that the crowd beat the people in the boat? But this would actually answer that in the sense that they were anticipating his arrival here. And so the people coming and going, running ahead from every town, they're on the lookout. And now they hear Jesus is coming back to this location. And so now everything, the plan is now set in motion, basically. And then point number 3, sheep without a shepherd in verse 34 is an idiom for military leadership. It goes beyond that, but here specifically, Montefiore's focusing in on that. He says, the phrase sheep without a shepherd means, according to Old Testament usage, not a congregation without a leader, but an army without a general, a nation without a national leader. So you will see that quite often with kings that have just died or whatever. You get that sheep without a shepherd language being used. 4, teaches them many things, also in verse 34, is a correction of messianic expectation. Mark uses almost the same phrase with similar meaning a little later in rather similar circumstances. And so it's not generic teaching them stuff. It's more so you think the Messiah is here to do this, but it's actually this over here. And it would fit with that motif because, of course, Mark 8:31, if we were to click out to it, it's when he foretells about his death and resurrection. In fact, this is get behind me, Satan, because Peter is like, nah, that's not going to happen. It has to happen this way. So that's what this phrase means. The green grass in verse 39 would equal Passover season, the time of the year for uprising. So he says, it was at this time of the year that the Messiah was expected to manifest himself. This then would have been the season of the year for a messianic uprising. And so on one hand, the commentaries will point out that the green grass is probably this vivid recollection, first person recollection. But at the same time, the only time of year that you would have had green grass in this wilderness kind of area was during this Passover season, which is a very theologically pregnant time of the year. Hundreds and fifties in verse 40 is language of military organization. So he writes, it is much more probable that Mark meant that the multitude sat down by companies of 50 and 100. His combination of a number and orderliness suggests not so much catering convenience as a military operation. The phrase carries overtones of the military divisions of the Jews during their wilderness wanderings, but the actual reference is probably to the different companies of men from different towns and villages. Now, I think that this is going a little bit too far here, but the previous statement about basically the numbers, census and stuff like that, basically all the commentaries will point this out. This does sound quite a bit like the wilderness wanderings. And again, these are fighting force numberings that are going on. So that would actually fit quite nicely. Point number 7, it's 5,000 men, adult males, which would be a fighting force. So it's not counting women and children. As he writes, it's hard to see a sufficient reason other than that they wish to initiate a revolt. So if it's just men of a fighting age going to meet the Davidic descendant, it's not hard to see what might have been going on in their mind. They want to make him the new Joshua, which again is exactly what we see in John's gospel. Point number 8, the departure of the disciples in verse 45, is Jesus' attempt to de-escalate the situation. And so he says here that this language of he made them leave or whatever is very strong. It's a very strong word to use. And nowhere else in the canonical gospels is Jesus said to have put this kind of pressure on his disciples. Jesus was left alone on the shore. It seems that he could trust no one, not the crowds, not even his disciples. This again suggests an attempt at a messianic uprising. And then the last point, he departs to the mountains for prayer. Verse 46 is Jesus' self-isolation in times of crisis. His mission, he knew, was to be the Son of Man, the spiritual and suffering Savior of his people. And the crisis of decision and the full realization of his spiritual mission drove him into the wilderness from the seashore to enter into solitary communion with his heavenly Father. And so all of these phrases are just so easy to read over as just narrative detail, but there's a lot underneath that if this thesis holds, which I think it should, namely because John 6 is pretty explicit that that is what indeed is going on in the story. But now let's turn to the narrative proper. So Mark 6:30, the apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. The term apostle appears only in this verse and a debated reading in Mark 3:14. So it's very possible this is the only reference to this term. Likewise, in another rare instance for Mark, the verb taught occurs 17 times throughout the gospel. It's an interesting number if you follow this channel. Yet this is the only case where Jesus is not the subject. So it's kind of interesting, some rare vocabulary here. Verses 31 and 32, and he said to them, come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while. For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. It may be more literally, they had no opportunity to eat. That'll become relevant in a moment. And they went away in the boat to a desolate place by themselves. And so Stein here is noting a chiasm. Again, not really super important. I just like to point these out, how symmetrical some of these verses often are. But as I write down here, Jesus' desire for his disciples to rest echoes his own withdrawal from the crowds in Mark 1:35, following a period of teaching and healing. Yet as in Mark 1:45 and 3:20, the ever-growing crowds make such rest impossible. And then Collins in her commentary is pointing out here that this language that they had no leisure, as the ESV puts it, it's the same language here of Herodias's opportune day. So as I click on this, that's why I think that you should probably have it be opportunity in bold just so you catch the resonance between the language here. And of course, it's in the case of Herodias and Herod, they're having this feast, a banquet, which results in the death of John the Baptist. And of course, down here, they can't even eat. And of course, shortly hereafter, there's going to be this grand feeding of 5,000 people. So it's a very subtle terminological hook between the two. As I continue, the desire for solitude goes unfulfilled as the crowd recognizes them. The desolate place serves as more than narrative detail, recalling the prologue. So let me just go ahead and click out to this. So 1-3, remember the voice of one crying in the wilderness. Verse 4 also has that language, and then down to the temptation in verse 12 and 13. So again, heavy callbacks to the prologue. And remember, the wilderness is this place of chaos, and in many ways, even demonic activity, things like that. Again, this goes back all the way to the prologue, the place of testing and temptation, stuff like that. Verse 34, and when he came ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. Collins connects this language to a Dead Sea Scroll. I think this is the community roll, if memory serves. Immediately following the roll of the assembly of the camps is the roll of the inspector of the camp. He shall instruct the many in the deeds of God, and shall teach them his mighty marvels, and recount to them the eternal events with their explanations. He shall have pity on them, like a father on his sons, and he will provide drink to all afflicted among them, like a shepherd his flock. The similarities between this passage and the context of the feeding of the crowd in Mark 6 are striking. And as she concludes down here, these similarities reinforce the inference that the groups of hundreds and fifties in verse 40 draw upon Scripture, Exodus 18 and Deuteronomy, to speak about the eschatological community. But this idiom, sheep without a shepherd, receives a lot of detail in the commentaries. I'll go ahead and read Watts here. He says, drawing perhaps on the traditions of provision in the first Exodus, Isaiah concludes his opening declaration of salvation, 40 verses 1 through 11, by likening Yahweh to a shepherd who tends his sheep, gathers his lamb in his arms, and gently leads the nursing ewes from Zion. And here he lists a number of passages. Given the prologue's programmatic character, it is not surprising that similar imagery reappears throughout subsequent chapters. The newly released and returning prisoners, whose bread Yahweh promised would not be lacking, 51:14, are described as pasturing on the heights, 49:9, as their compassionate God provides food for the hungry and water for the thirsty, and miraculously transforms the wilderness. So this sheep without a shepherd language, again, resonances of a nation without their king, without their warrior king, especially. But also, there's all of this shepherding language that goes back to God. God himself was going to deliver this new Exodus and provide food, water, and miraculously transform the wilderness. So there's all of these eschatological expectations going on. In fact, we'll hit it later, but that wilderness stuff, the wilderness wandering period, the feast that had most to do with that is the Feast of Tabernacles, which is all over the prologue of Mark. All of those passages that Mark cites have to do with that Feast of Tabernacles, Feast of Booths concepts of wilderness wandering and God providing during those times. For the sake of time, I'm not going to read all of these. These will be in the notes that you can download at your leisure and read this. I do want to highlight, though, Ezekiel 34. I think Stein gets into it in his. So it's saying that this recalls a bunch of Old Testament allusions. David and his successors are often portrayed as shepherds of God's people, Psalm 78 and Ezekiel 34. The Christological nature of this saying may be especially apparent in Numbers 27, 16, and 17, where Moses' request for someone to lead Israel is answered in Joshua. Now, a greater Joshua, of course, Jesus is the same name in Greek, who possesses even more of the Spirit, has come to lead Israel. The promise to shepherd of Ezekiel 34:23 would feed Israel, and Jesus now feeds his people. And what is referring to here, this passage is interesting. Ezekiel 34:23, and I will set over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he shall feed them. He shall feed them and be their shepherd. And I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David shall be prince among them. I am the Lord, I have spoken. And this is Ezekiel. This is well after David is off the scene. So obviously this is a Davidic descendant, but very interesting. We're finally getting the resolution of all of these scattered threads throughout the prophets. And Psalm 78 is also interesting in this context, for he chose David, his servant, and took him from the sheepfolds to shepherd Jacob, his people, with upright heart. He shepherded. What's interesting is Psalm 78 is, I have another video on this, it's the center of the Psalter. So there's a lot of interesting things. I want to say Psalm 78 comes up again. Yeah, that I just remembered what it is. Psalm 78 has an interesting line, which I think I get to later in this. But this is actually the psalm that talks about the people eating bread from heaven, eating the food of the angels. Man ate the bread of the angels. Momentarily, these sheep without a shepherd are going to be miraculously fed by Jesus, the great shepherd. Continuing on, the many things Jesus teaches the crowd look forward to Mark 8:31, another passage where Jesus must correct the expectations of his mission to his disciples. Now down to verse 35. And when it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a desolate place, The hour is now late. Scholars debate the late hour terminology. Masuda writes, this is an article, I think I have this article on Ko-Fi, but for the sake of time, I'll just read this latter part with some of the highlighted portion, get a gist of what he's saying. He said, we thus enlist the context in which hour is used in Mark. It becomes clear that, except in the two occurrences in this account, the feeding account, of the miracle of the bread, it is used only referring to the passion and the parousia of the Son of Man. From the above consideration, avoiding contradiction of the following pericope, it can be said to be used in relation with the Last Supper. This pregnant usage of hour in relation with the Last Supper coincides with Mark's interest in bread as seen in the redactional verses of 8, 19, and 21. However, countering this in a footnote, Brandt says, it surely goes beyond the bounds of exegesis to argue, as Masuda does, that because elsewhere in Mark, hour is used only in connection with Jesus' passion and parousia, its use here must link this pericope with the Last Supper. And I largely agree with him. I put it this way. Perhaps it may be simply observed that the term hour carries eschatological significance, even if no specific event is in view. So this is one of those things where it's like the disciples just say something, the hour is late, and it's just narrative detail on one level, but there's this deep level of theology embedded in that. It's like foreshadowing that they don't even know what they're saying. And so even if we can't directly tie this to the Last Supper per se, because there's a lot of debate about that kind of stuff, I do think you can at least say it's eschatological. But as I continue supporting this observation that it's eschatological, the same verse includes the final of 3 references to the desolate place, or desert, wilderness, a term also translated elsewhere as desert and wilderness. And so I go on to Sidebar here. Now, I felt the need that we actually do need to go on this because this will help us appreciate what exactly is going on, the theology behind why this feeding miracle is so important, especially in relation to Jesus' identity. Because remember, at the end of this narrative, not just this one, but the walking on the water motif, after that happens, Mark connects the two as somehow interpreting each other. And so I think it's through this. So recall from the discussion on Mark's prologue that each cited text, Malachi 3:1, Exodus 23:20, Isaiah 40, verse 3, is linked by the theme of the Exodus and the new Exodus. The original Exodus event was commemorated in the Feast of Tabernacles, which in turn became eschatologized into the hope of a new Exodus. The figure that led the first Exodus was the divine warrior, the angel of the Lord, whatever you want to call him. The new Exodus is led by the divine warrior made flesh. He becomes incarnate. One element of the ancient Near Eastern combat myth, or the Chaos Conf, was the dismembering and scattering of the dragon in the wilderness. So we went over some of this stuff in part 1, and I also went into this in more depth in the Divine Warrior videos. There's a whole playlist on my channel that serves as a good backdrop for all this. But continuing on, for example, Anat slays and scatters the dragon in KTU, blah, blah, blah. She sets a muzzle on Tunan. I don't know if that should be Tanun. She binds him on the heights of Lebanon. Toward the desert shall you be scattered, O Yam. Yam is the Hebrew and Ugaritic word for sea. And this is actually the word for river. Maybe the closest biblical parallel is Psalm 74, 12 through 14. Yet God, my king, is from old, working salvation. Of course, as you can see, Yeshuot, in the midst of the earth. You divided the sea by your might. You broke the heads of the sea monsters on the waters. You crushed the heads of Leviathan. You gave him as food for creatures in the wilderness. This is that same language, the wilderness, desert. Other parallels exist. I just give this one for flavoring, but any other we could go to. Speak and say, thus says the Lord God, behold, I am against you, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, the great dragon that lies in the midst of his streams. Down to verse 4, I will put hooks in your jaws, so on and so forth. That hooks language is part of that binding motif. And then after the binding, I will cast you into the wilderness, and you and all the fish of your streams, you shall fall on the open field and not be brought together or gathered. To the beasts of the earth and to the birds of the heavens, I give you as food. The Greek, the LXX of Ezekiel, uses a different word for wilderness in verse 5. However, the word is used in verse 9. So the land of Egypt will be destroyed and deserted. It will become a desert. It'll be this wasteland kind of idea. Because of these and related themes, the eschatologized Feast of Tabernacles came to depict the chaos creatures of old as the very meal served at the messianic banquet. So let me just break in here, make sure you get where this is going. So the original Exodus, you have these kinds of texts that are calling back to it. So you have Yahweh defeating, crushing, splitting, dismembering these chaos creatures, and then scattering them, and that becomes food in the wilderness. And so it's like he did that in the past. Again, this is symbolic. He did that in the past. He's going to do it again in the future. And this time it's going to be even grander, even bigger. And so these chaos creatures are going to be the very food in the eschatologized future version. So for Ezra, then you kept in existence two living creatures, the name of one you called Behemoth and the name of the other Leviathan. And so again, we get Behemoth, Leviathan, so on and so forth. And you have kept them to be eaten by whom you wish and when you wish. Similarly, 2 Baruch 29:4, and it will happen that when all that which should come to pass in these parts has been accomplished, the anointed one will begin to be revealed, and Behemoth will reveal itself from its place, and Leviathan will come from the sea. The two great monsters which I created on the fifth day of creation, which I shall have kept until that time, and they will be nourishment for all who are left. Heiser, in his book Demons, writes of the Enochic version of this tradition. So this is 1 Enoch 60. On that day, two monsters will be parted. One monster, a female named Leviathan, in order to dwell in the abyss of the ocean over the fountains of the water, and the other a male called Behemoth, which holds his chest in an invisible desert whose name is Dundayin, east of the Garden of Eden, wherein the elect and the righteous ones dwell, wherein my grandfather was taken, the seventh from Adam, the first man whom the Lord of spirits created. Then I asked the second angel in order that he may show me how strong these monsters are, and how they were separated on this day and were cast, one into the abyss of the ocean and the other into the dry desert. Heiser concludes, the passage clearly considers Behemoth as the land-desert counterpart of the chaos monster Leviathan. This sea-land pairing of twin chaos forces is implicit in Job 40:15 through 41:34. So those two chapters are about Behemoth and then Leviathan, and continues well into rabbinic literature. Behemoth occupies an invisible desert called Dundayin. Nickelsburg and Vanderkam note that the spelling of this place varies in manuscript data. 4 of these readings indicate a connection with the reading Daudael in 1 Enoch 10:4. This was the pit in the place of jagged rocks where Azazel, that is Satan, was cast and imprisoned. Once again, to kind of connect some of this, if it's not all snapping into place, you have these chaos entities scattered, and really the place of the scattering tends to be the wilderness, the desert, the very place in which Jesus and the disciples have just ventured into. So keep that in mind as we move forward. So Day, I think it's John Day, in God's conflict with the sea dragon, adds, it is wholly in keeping with the view that the eschatological banquet in Judaism had its origin in the banquet following Yahweh's and ultimately Baal's victory over the unruly sea and the chaos monsters that in 2nd Ezra, 2nd Baruch, 1st Enoch, Baba Bathra 74, it is specifically the chaos monsters Leviathan and Behemoth, which are to be devoured at the messianic banquet. We recall too the reference to the slaying of Leviathan in Isaiah 27:1. I'll actually return to that text in a moment. And for the sake of time, I think I'm going to pass over Dempsey's quote. It's Dempsey interacting with Micah Keel, who's also arguing this messianic banquet idea. He thinks part of this is the emphasis or the fact that it gives us the detail of the 2 fish, even though Jesus actually didn't even ask about the fish. He just asked about bread. So he similarly goes in this direction of the chaos creatures. So as I summarize down here, at creation, Yahweh divided the waters. At the Exodus, following the decreative plagues upon Egypt, Yahweh again divided the Red Sea, or the Red Sea. The Feast of Tabernacles commemorates God's provision during the wilderness wanderings that followed. Seeing themselves as living in a state of spiritual exile and wilderness, the people longed for a new Exodus, one culminating in a feast where the ancient chaos entities themselves would become the meal. But down to verse 36 and following, this is the disciples speaking. Send them away to go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. But he answered them, you give them something to eat. That's actually emphatic. You yourselves give them something to eat. And they said to him, shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat? 200 denarii. So this would be 200 days of work. That's even assuming you could find a place to fill that kind of order. But continuing on, and he said to them, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. And when they had found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then he commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups by hundreds and by 50s. Now, Collins writes here, and he's just commenting on the language here that they sat down in groups. It's like they lounged around, and literally here is drinking parties. Is well understood as a banquet. The use of this word suggests that the meal hosted by Jesus is a kind of banquet. This connotation suggests a contrasting parallel with the festive dinner or banquet given by Herod Antipas. Whereas Herod presumably provided a lavish menu, Jesus provides a simple meal of bread and fish. Whereas Herod invited the nobles of Galilee, Jesus welcomes a crowd of ordinary people and meets their basic needs. The imagery of banqueting is reminiscent of the eschatological banquet of Isaiah 25, 6-8. The mark in Jesus commands the disciples to have the crowd recline on the green grass. Now, as I write down here, Isaiah 25, of course, belongs to the so-called mini-apocalypse of Isaiah, chapters 24-27, with the final chapter beginning as follows, and this was cited earlier. In that day, the Lord with his hard and great and strong sword will punish Leviathan the fleeing serpent, Leviathan the twisting serpent, and he will slay the dragon that is in the sea. So if we're supposed to be seeing a messianic banquet here, again, this is part of that banquet. It's part of the menu. I'm going to pass over the Stein quote, but I will note that the green grass, some do connect it to, obviously, Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd. And then, of course, the line down in green grass. Stein thinks it's superficial, but a lot of commentaries will go in that direction. And I think given the shepherd imagery, it's probably not a stretch. Down to verse 40, so they sat down in groups by hundreds and by 50s. Gillick notes that the Qumran literature takes such groupings as an eschatological model for their own sectarian life. And here he lists a number of scrolls. And specifically for the messianic banquet. Thus, the arrangement points back to the time of God's miraculous provision for the needs of the people in the wilderness, and hints at the eschatological moment in the gathering of God's people into communities at the end time. And here I want to loop back to an observation I made in last video. I write here, recall Lane's comments about Mark's inclusion of the staff in Jesus' instruction of the 12. So if you recall earlier, chapter 6, specifically verse 8, where he tells them, take nothing for their journey except a staff. And then he says, no bread, no bag, no money. So he tells them to travel light, but he does allow them to travel with a staff. In the parallel, you do have there explicitly also the staff is excluded. So this is a classic contradiction here. And I went in the literary direction where I think you can make a very strong case that what's going on is it's an Exodus motif. So the instruction of Jesus was to travel light. That's true in all the Gospels. But the reason why Mark allows the staff is because that echoes Exodus 12, right before God has victory over the gods of Egypt, which remember the disciples are being sent out to cast out demons. And so Lane wrote back there, the missionary instruction given to the 12 is patterned after the instruction given to Israel at the outset of the wilderness experience. Again, the wilderness experience. The injunction to take neither bread nor bag can be understood in the same context. As Israel in the wilderness was nourished by the provision of God, so the disciples are to be sustained by God's provision. And that kind of blew my mind last time, because right after this, in the same chapter, what are we going to see? In the case of Exodus, they leave with minimal provisions, but God provides for them manna, the bread of heaven, as Psalm 78 calls it. And so I think that there is definitely an Exodus motif going on back there in Mark 6:8, because we're about to see that miraculous provision of God. And again, it's by who? It's by Jesus, aka by God. As I write, we are soon to see a dramatic demonstration of God's provision in the wilderness. Down to verse 41, and taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. Dempsey explains, With the apocalyptic significance of the miracle clear enough, we see that Mark narrates the event as an instance of Jesus dividing and scattering the fish. Remember that's part of the divine warrior motif, dividing and then scattering the corpse of the chaos entity. In fact, Jesus' actions are so similar. So Psalm 74, Mark may be alluding to that text as a very script for the event. Though not in precisely the same order, the basic elements are the same in each. So the primordial battle becomes the eschatological banquet itself, the Feast of Tabernacles, the cosmic New Year feast, and Jesus filling the role as the messianic divine warrior. As I write, the thematic symmetry between the two narratives is remarkable. And so in Psalm 74, we see Yahweh, he divided the sea, broke the heads of the dragons, gave them as food in the wilderness. And then Jesus here divided the fish, broke the bread, gave them to the disciples as food in the wilderness. And then moving down to Colin, she writes, the miraculous provision of bread in Mark 6 is also analogous to the biblical text describing the miraculous provision of manna in the wilderness. According to Exodus 16, while the people of Israel were in the wilderness of sin, they complained to Moses and Aaron that they were dying of hunger. The last statement, Exodus 16:12, and you will know that I am the Lord your God. I am Yahweh, your Elohim, indicates that the purpose of the miracle is not only to provide the people with needed nourishment, but also to manifest the power and glory of God and to establish or reestablish a relationship between God and the people. I find this actually really interesting in light of John 6, because again, this is exactly what's happening. The people want the food, they want the miracles, and Jesus basically runs them off with his words because he knows their hearts. He knows that what they're actually after. But this miracle isn't about that, just providing for them. It's about demonstrating his identity of who he actually is. And in Mark's gospel, that's been really the key. That's been the crux of the question all over the place. Who then is this man? Who is this man that does these things? And this miracle is meant to serve to answer that, just like all his other acts are. As I write down here, the connection to the manna in the wilderness, which follows immediately after the crossing of the Red Sea in Exodus 15, becomes even more striking in light of the next narrative, Mark. See below. We're not going to hit that yet, but again, the two narratives are connected. France comments on the possible connection to the Last Supper, which I'm actually going to skip over just for the sake of time. But if you want to pause and read that, you can. But as I write, either way, Mark might be alluding to and juxtaposing a different banquet altogether, as France notes in page 260, and here is relating it back to Antipas. The story goes on with a very different meal. The food is basic, but the circumstances and reminiscences of Old Testament events in the narrative mark out this simple meal as of more ultimate significance than the tetrarch's lavish birthday party. For those with eyes to see, this will be the foretaste of the messianic banquet, an introduction to the communal life of the kingdom of God. And I think that's very well put, because even though I'm going on this eschatological meal idea, the reality is it's only an echo. It's only the already in the already but not yet. So there is an ultimate marriage supper of the Lamb feast idea, but that's in the end of end. But continuing down to verse 42, and they all ate and were satisfied. Interesting in light of this verse is Psalm 131 in Greek. So it's 32:15 in Hebrew, but it says, I will surely bless her widow, her poor I will satisfy with food. So it's satisfy, but literally with bread. It's the Greek term there is bread. Collins notes another intertextual link. And so here she's going back to Psalm 78, which we looked at earlier. As noted above, one set of important intertexts for this miracle story involves the theme of the feeding of the people in Israel in the wilderness with manna and quails. The presentation of this theme in Psalm 78 has an important similarity with verse 42, which reads, and they all ate and were satisfied. Psalm 78 is a didactic psalm that instructs the people on the basis of Israel's history. The account of the gift of manna includes the following statement, and they ate and were filled exceedingly, and he brought them their desire. That's actually 77:29 in the Greek. And I forgot I pointed this out here in the notes, 78:24 and 25. And he rained for them manna to eat, and he gave them bread of heaven for them. A person ate bread of angels. He sent provision for them in excess. Collins again notes themes of eschatological banquet. In context, the 12 baskets full. is also reminiscent of the motif of abundance in the tradition of the eschatological banquet. For those members of the audience who recognized in the groups of verse 40 an allusion to the organization of the eschatological community, that's the hundreds and fifties, the fact that the leftover pieces filled 12 baskets would probably recall the hope for the restoration of the 12 tribes in the time of fulfillment. Because again, that was a big part of the eschatological hope, was that, of course, it included all 12 tribes, even the 10 so-called lost tribes in the north. Down to verse 44, and those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. In France, in a footnote, the large audience. To put this number into perspective, the total population of Capernaum at this time, including women and children, was probably about 10,000. This throws light on the statement in verse 33 that the 5,000 came from all over the place, basically, since the total adult male population of Capernaum would be well under 5,000. Mark mentions only men, this is me writing now, omitting women and children. At first, this seems to differ from Matthew 14:21, but as Montefiore notes, the phrase may mean without any admixture of women or children. In other words, they weren't there. There were no women or children there. It was actually just predominantly men, because again, if this goes back to the military uprising setting, it would have been mostly men that showed up here to try to start the revolution, basically. Those two can actually be reconciled, potentially. Just to kind of sum up the feeding narrative, we had these Old Testament expectations of this banquet, messianic banquet, and even in the intertestamental period, there developed these ideas that the food would be the chaos entities. And so we have Jesus showing up in a wilderness, just coming off the sea and serving this bread and the fish, and symbolically, it seems to be connected to these ideas of Jesus fulfilling the role in a very symbolic, very subtle way. He's fulfilling the role of the divine warrior, once again, as has been doing through all these chapters. And these are stacked in the sense of, it might seem like a stretch in one or two of these, but it's one after the other. Each chapter, he seems to be doing things like this. And then right after this, it's going to get really explicit as far as the divine warrior activity goes. So down to verse 45 and following, immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. And remember, he's probably here trying to de-escalate the situation. And after he had taken leave of them, he went up on the mountain to pray. And when evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. After denying the crowd's attempt to enthrone him before his time, Jesus retreats to the mountain to pray alone. Gillick writes, the mountain may relate to the epiphanic thrust of the story. In other words, like an appearance of God. God appeared to Israel from the mountain, and Jesus appears to the disciples after being on the mountain with God in prayer. Here and in 135, Jesus takes time out from his public ministry to pray alone. Also compare 1432. Down to 648, and he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. And about the fourth watch of the night, roughly 3 a.m. to 6 a.m., he came to them walking on the sea. He meant to pass by them. Gillick notes another Exodus callback. So he's talking about the fourth watch of the night. Reckons according to Roman time, the Jews had 3 watches in a night, between 3 and 6 in the morning. In 135, Jesus had arisen very early to pray. Similarly, God destroyed the Egyptians in the sea during the morning watch, Exodus 14:24. This would mean that the disciples who had left in the late afternoon or evening had struggled most of the night and made little headway. But as I write here, however, the most blatant divine warrior motif and Exodus imagery occurs here as well. Walking on the sea fulfills a classic ancient Near Eastern divine warrior motif, trampling the defeated foe. As Dempsey elaborates, considering their relation to the sea walking miracle, Hill concludes, by walking on the sea, Jesus reveals himself as the Son of God, endowed with absolute power of dominance over the ungodly power of the waters of chaos. However, because Hill focuses just on the trampling of the sea, he does not speak to the other mythological resonances with the combat myth. For example, Psalm 91, which we saw Mark using in the opening battle between Jesus and the devil, includes the assurance, You will tread on the lion and the adder, the young lion and the serpent you will trample underfoot. The Septuagint, the Greek, translates this verse with imagery even more at home in the Chaos Comp tradition, replacing adder with the mythological serpentine beast basilisk and aggrandizing the serpent to dragon. As I continue, other texts can be considered as part of the mosaic. Psalm 77:19, your way was the sea, your path through the great waters, yet your footprints were unseen. Habakkuk 3:15, you trampled the sea with your horses, the surging of mighty waters. We went over a lot of these texts in part 1. And of course, the Divine Warrior playlist, I list even more. However, the most relevant passages appear to be Job 9:8 and Exodus 33:19 and following, given the disciples' response and the narrative details, which we'll get into shortly, down to verse 49 and 51. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out. For they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, take heart, it is I. Literally, I am. Do not be afraid. And he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased, and they were utterly astounded. After creation imagery, Job asks in Job 9:8, who alone stretched out the heavens and trampled the waves of the sea? Following more creation imagery, Job continues in verse 11, behold, he passes by me, and I see him not. He moves on, but I do not perceive him. As Jesus strides upon the waves, like the warrior god of old, he intends to pass by his disciples. This recalls Exodus 33. Following Moses' intercession, he requests to behold God's glory. And Yahweh responds that no human can see my face and live. Instead, he will pass by and proclaim his name. That's 33:19 and verse 22. So here's verse 19. And he said, I will make all my glory pass before you, and I will proclaim before you my name, the Lord. That is Yahweh. And I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and I will show mercy on whom I will show mercy. When the disciples cry out in fear, Jesus replies with ego eimi, usually translated, it is I, but more literally, I am I, or more theologically, I am. As Collins notes, according to Deuteronomy, God said, see that I am, and there is no God except me. Here I've underlined the ego eimi phrase for us. That's 32:39 in the LXX. The book of Isaiah portrays God as saying, I, God, am the first and the future I am, and of course, again, ego eimi. Those in the audience who had grasped the assimilation of Jesus to God in this passage, and who were familiar with the passage cited here from Deuteronomy and Isaiah, in which it is I or I am, functions as a divine name, or quality may have understood the expression of Jesus in similar terms. She's kind of hedging her bets. Absolutely, that is what's going on. Gillick adds, at the level of the reader, hearer, Jesus coming to the disciples from prayer on the mountain and his miraculously walking on the sea to pass by makes ego eimi, I am, an echo of the Old Testament revelation formula of God, and sets this story off from the post-Easter appearance stories. The reader/hearer perceives that the disciples could have heard, and may have heard at the level of the pre-Markan tradition, a statement of self-revelation, a divine revelation to the disciples through Jesus who comes to them walking on the sea. And Gillick concludes here, using language drawn from the experience of Moses and Elijah of God's self-revelation as a passing by, the story underscores the epiphany by having Jesus identify himself with the pregnant it is I or I am. The I am formula in this epiphanic setting with Jesus coming from the mountain during the early morning hour of prayer to his own corresponds with the disciples' exclamation in Matthew 14:33, truly you are the Son of God. The formula answers the question of who Jesus is. Before I move on, I should note that I have a video that I did on Matthew following this Divine Warrior stuff. It's Andrew Angel's article where he points out that this confession, the Son of God, truly you are the Son of God, truly this was the Son of God, happened at the crucifixion and here in Matthew at the water walk. And he's arguing that these are Divine Warrior motifs happening in the crucifixion and here as well. So Matthew's version also has Divine Warrior motifs embedded in this story. So I think not just Mark, this would have been understood by ancient people as an act of deity and so on and so forth. In fact, we'll hit that momentarily, but as I write, interestingly, Moses and Elijah will both appear at the transfiguration in Mark 9:4. So they get this passing by theophany, but they're going to show up later. After surveying the contemporary literature for a number of pages, Collins concludes here, the fact that it is God alone in the Hebrew Bible who is said to walk on water, in addition to the theophanic elements in verses 45 through 52, makes it likely that such members of the audience of Mark would have understood that the passage implies the divinity of Jesus. And later, she writes, Jesus' depiction as walking on the sea reveals that he is the agent of God. I remember I actually added this quote just because if you follow this series along, I like to put these in here because she makes me laugh because she does this all the time where she has to hedge her bets with this kind of stuff for like a lower Christology. It can't be high. There has to be some skepticism placed in there somewhere. And so again, God is walking on the sea in the Old Testament. God is trampling the waves of the sea over and over. And then Jesus appears to them saying, I am. And what's her response to this? It reveals that he is the agent of God. Like, why? Again, I know why she does this, but there's no need for agent in that. It reveals that he is the God. You don't need agent of. You can take that out. Who can perform deeds like those of God of the Hebrew Bible. It also suggests that he is a king who, by divine power, can walk on water, unlike arrogant rulers who only vainly imagine that they can. And this goes back to what she was surveying, because she goes through a lot of, again, contemporary literature about this kind of stuff. And in a similar vein, Jason Combs, in his article, An Absurdity, in Mark 49 through 50, picks up another angle of the Greco-Roman audience would have understood. Combs concludes in his article, so this is after setting up and going through all of the evidence. He says, after Jesus identifies himself, Mark describes the astonishment of the disciples, their lack of understanding, and the reason for that lack. Their hearts were hardened. The disciples' lack of understanding has long been recognized as a marked theme that appears throughout the gospel. Here it forms a striking narrative portrayal of cognitive dissonance. So the whole point of his article is this. The disciples clearly want Jesus to be something he is not, to the point that they are willing to believe the absurd when Jesus approaches them as something much grander than they had imagined. Gods and divine men walk on water. Ghosts do not. And so, again, that's what has been establishing throughout the article. He's going through the contemporary literature. He's pointing out how Mark kind of sets the scene like it's going to be a ghost story, and then it's not. Jesus is doing something that ghosts don't do, but gods and God men do. That is, walk on water. So to that audience, when Jesus comes walking on the water, the Gentile audience would hear that and immediately know this is God-man. And the disciples are like, oh, it must be a ghost. It's like the one thing they shouldn't conclude, they conclude. They're just so unable to wrap their minds around what they're seeing in Jesus, which is kind of funny to me because, in fact, Combs actually mentions Collins. I think he might have been her student. So they actually positively interact with each other. But it's funny to me, though, because in many ways, Collins is, no pun intended, right there in the boat. She's in the same boat as the disciples, where she just will not accept the plain understanding of what's going on. She would rather posit, he's the agent of God. He's not God. Like, you need to put some distance between what God actually is and what I want him to be. And anyway, the article does a really good job of setting this up where it's like, they should know better. They see Jesus doing the one thing a ghost can't do, but something deity does. And they're like, well, he must be a ghost. But finishing off with Combs, he says, but when the disciples see Jesus walking on water, they believe the impossible rather than the obvious. Mark's insertion of this absurdity, because they saw him walking on the sea, they thought he was a ghost, emphasizes in dramatic fashion the disciples' misconstrual of Jesus' messiahship. As I conclude, simply, the Gentile audience knew ghosts don't walk on water, but gods and God-men could. The disciples likewise knew of God, the God, who trampled the waves of the sea, but they refused to believe that was who passed by their boat. Down to verses 51 and 52, and he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased, and they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. Mark intentionally links the miracle of the walking on water to the feeding of the multitude. Some commentators note that since the disciples had already received divine authority in Mark 6, 7 through 12, they should have taken initiative in the feeding miracle, but failed, prompting Jesus to act. So remember, Jesus says, "You feed them," and they don't. So Jesus steps in. Soon after, they again faced danger at sea and failed to respond faithfully. On a deeper level, these narratives echo Yahweh's acts of deliverance. Jesus provides bread in the wilderness, like manna, and then tramples the sea. Yet the disciples do not recognize him as the divine deliverer because their hearts are hardened, an explicit echo of the Exodus. Dempsey concludes, the procession and enthronement of Yahweh at the Feast of Tabernacles acted as the chief ritual epiphany in Israelite cult. In other words, throughout the book is establishing that part of that Tabernacles New Year celebration would have been the cleaning out of the sacred space and then the procession, this parade back into the temple with the ark. And so the people would see the ark pass by. So the transfer of Yahweh's ark was the time when all of Israel saw Yahweh no longer hidden within the Holy of Holies, but moving in procession to the celebration of thronging spectators. Indeed, the image of Yahweh would then literally be seen to pass by his people as the ark made its way to its sacred destinations. This was the day of the Lord, which later writers interpreted as the eschatological day of the Lord's judgment over the earth. So Jesus appears to his disciples in epiphanic glory in the same context of victory over the chaos forces. That is rather interesting because I'm not sure if he's thinking of the victory over the chaos forces, the walking aspect, or what we just saw with the feeding narrative. That is, he splits and divides, and he does all of that stuff. That was, again, remember Psalm 74 kind of stuff. He's doing all of that, and then he comes and passes by, just like the Feast of Tabernacles, where the Ark of the Covenant was paraded back in. Again, remember, this is the ritualized version of what happened at the Exodus. They're ritualizing that Exodus trek through the waters into Holy Land. And so they're parading the Ark of the Covenant back in to the temple. And so here we have Jesus after dismembering the serpent, the dragon, Leviathan. He then passes by his disciples in this epiphanic scene. We're actually following the same script in Mark with the Exodus. So we have victory at the Reed Sea in chapter 15. We have manna in chapter 16. And so far in Mark's gospel, remember, we had the drowning of the legion of demons. And many of the commentaries were pointing out, hey, this looks a lot like the Exodus story with Pharaoh and his host, his legion, being drowned in the sea. And so we had victory there. And then what followed that? Because that was chapter 5. Well, when we get to chapter 6, now we have a miraculous feeding. Just like manna in the wilderness, we have this feeding of the 5,000 in the wilderness. And if we follow that same script, after the golden calf episode, again, that's when Moses intercedes and asks to see the God's glory, and God passes by. And instead of seeing the glory, because he can't contain it, Yahweh passes by him and declares his name. What's his name? Yahweh, I am. And so after the feeding miracle, the disciples are in the boat, Jesus is passing by them, and they cry out, and Jesus says, fear not, I am. He declares the divine name. And so I think that that's actually what's really going on with why we have this narrative aside that they didn't understand about the loaves. I think that that's the larger part of the narrative, is that it's connecting his identity. They still don't get it yet. Even after the feeding miracle, and even here, after seeing this, they're still not putting it all together yet. And later, Dempsey concludes, this theme of misunderstanding Jesus' identity as the victorious divine warrior is pervasive in Mark. The irony of the gospel is that after being urged for centuries to take action and fight the forces of chaos, God is finally doing so, but no one recognizes it. So I debated about whether I was going to do any of this or not. And over at Sentinel Apologetics channel, he's been going through Mark as well. I think he's on chapter 2 right now. He's doing these live streams. And you'll often see me in the side chat or in the comments. If you've followed my channel at all, you know that I'm like into, and I do accept on some level that gematria is happening throughout the Bible. I'm into like sacred architecture and stuff like that. And my check and balance has always been, does it serve the plain reading of the text? If you're drawing some conclusion that is opposite of what the plain text has through some symbology, that is, you take some symbolic reading that just contradicts what the plain text is getting at, then I don't think you have something. I think you're seeing things, you're taking things too far. And this, for me, just stretches to the very edges of it where I'm like, it depends on what side of the bed I wake up on, whether I think that some of this stuff is legitimate or not. Now, I've known about this for a long time. A couple of times this has come up on my channel. I know people have messaged me about it, and I know at least one public comment I've talked about that I'm not into David Feidler's work. Feidler is a Gnostic. And in fact, I know who he was drawing on in his book for a lot of this information was actually was John Mitchell. I'm not sure if you call him a Gnostic exactly, but he certainly was anti-Christian. Rob from Sentinel Apologetics is actually drawing from Feidler, but he's filtering it through an Orthodox Christian lens. Now, I'm going to be really brief. I'm not going to go too far into this. If you find this interesting, I would encourage you to check him out in his channel. And I'm very interested in when he does this chapter in Mark 6. Now, I'm actually going to read his conclusion first, because I think his conclusion is a good summary. He says, in summary, Mark's purpose for the Greco-Roman reader is to theologically demonstrate high Christology. That is, Jesus is the extratemporal celestial logos personified as teacher, leader, shepherd, and provider of sustenance. Now, symbolically speaking, how does he do that? Like, how do you get there? Well, you get there through sacred architecture, math, and gematria. So I'll just jump in and out of this. In Euclidean geometry, a triangle is a plane bounded by 3 straight lines, but in Greek mathematics, it is a single unit of space that is bounded by 3 dots. So A, B, and C. The dots function as boundary stones for its field area. Thus, the number 3, when depicted as a triangle, is singular. Likewise, with the number 2 when elongated from A to B. Then here he's going to get into even things like triangular numbers. So you get 1, 2, 3, 4, then 3, then 2, then 1, which is 10. So that's, in fact, the number, and he might actually mention it, 666, is actually a triangular. In fact, it's a double triangular number because 36 is the base, which itself is triangular. Anyway, that's a whole other thing. But I'm not going to get into all of the details about this stuff, but he's kind of setting things up. But he says, returning to Mark's account of 5,000 men, they are sitting in the field. This is the starting point for the development of the geometry. So the 5,000 is represented mathematically as a perfect square containing 5,000 square units, one for each person. A square containing 5,000 square units has each side measuring roughly 70.7 units in length. 707 or 707 is the Greek gematria value for the god Hermes. The god Hermes was an earlier representation, or Greek representation of Logos, and Hermes was also the god of shepherds. The Logos represented teaching and guiding and leading. Thus, the Logos organizes and leads in the same way that the shepherd god Hermes guides his herd. And of course, then here, Rob cites, they were a sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. And then here's where the math kind of starts jumping in. So he sets them down in groups of hundreds and fifties. And so you have this division now. So here, the B to B is 50 units. Here, from A to A, would be 100. And he says, Jesus divides the 2 fish among the 5,000, represented by 3 perfectly interpenetrating circles forming the 3 world diagram of Hellenistic cosmology. This gives rise to 2 fish forms, or Vesica Pisces, in the 5,000 square units. Each Vesica has a horizontal unit which measures 612 units. So he's talking about this over here. So we have fish 1, fish 2, and then you're going to have this creates the well-known fish symbol. But 612, remember, they're halved. So together they're 122.4, which 1224 or 1224 is the Greek gematria value for fishes. Each one of the circles has a circumference of 222 units, and each Vesica has a perimeter of 148 units, or 148.0. Of course, 1,480, those same numbers, is the Greek gematria value for Christos, or Christ. The perimeter of the square measures 282 units. 282 is the Greek gematria value for bios, life. In fact, here, I know, I'm pretty sure I've seen the image, and it might be in Mitchell's book. I know I've seen the image before of if you put like a 5-pointed, like a star in this, the way it divides, the math breakdown of this, the 1480 and then the 888. So you end up with Jesus and then Christ on the bottom. I'll show a picture of it when I find it. I don't know where it's at, but I'll look for it. So you could also get some interesting stuff, and which is actually interesting because it quite looks like a cruciform image with the head, the arms, and then the legs. But he continues, thus having obtained the basic geometry, the square containing the 5,000 is removed for clarity. And here he actually gets into the magic square of the sun stuff, Revelation, the number of the beast. We'll skip over that. If a hexagon is drawn in the lower circle, the hexagon will hold a circle which has a circumference of 192.3. 1,923 is the Greek gematria value for Christ, the Logos. Then 5 smaller circles are drawn to represent the 5 loaves. So as you can see, the 5 here. Together, they have the combined perimeter of 481 units. 481 is the Greek value for the term for loaves. The length XY is 122.4 units. So he's talking about this and then this over here. 1,224 is the Greek gematria value for fishes. The provisions of the meal having been supplied, one final aspect of the story needs to be represented. The disciples picked up 12 baskets full of leftover bread and fish. This is represented by drawing the perfectly symmetrical 12-fold flower design in the upper circle. By drawing 12 arcs with a compass set at the original size of the 3 primary circles, each arc has a measure of 74 units. The total measure of the arcs making up the pattern is is 74. Again, each unit times 12 is 888, which is the Greek gematria value for Jesus. And then he concludes with what I read earlier. So there's actually quite a bit of symbolic value in the numbers. Generally, most people just focus on the 12 and say, oh, well, the 5 loaves, maybe that's like a 5 book of Moses. You add them together, you get 7 days of creation. 12 is the 12 disciples. But there could be some of this sacred math stuff going on for why those numbers specifically. Now, on the flip side of this, now there are some that just will dismiss this outright and just be like, nope. My pushback to this on one level would be, okay, but what about the feeding of the 4,000? Now, if you could demonstrate there, maybe you would have more to go off of. The other thing is, again, going back to the Gnostic thing, because what Feidler's trying to do with all of this is trying to represent Jesus as just another one of these enlightened kind of individual type thing. It has nothing to do with the Old Testament. Again, if you're a Gnostic, you're very anti the Old Testament. And if you followed along through this video so far, it's like there's no way you can decouple Jesus from the Old Testament. He is the divine warrior of the Old Testament. It completely butchers the plain reading of the text to do the Gnostic thing with it. However, could Mark be doing something with these numbers, with this sacred math, sacred geometry stuff? Could he be doing this where he is representing Jesus as he's the true Hermes, he's the true shepherd, the true Logos? And the numbers being used here or chosen specifically were for to be able to do this kind of stuff with it. I don't have a problem with that. I think it was the Aristotle quote, there's more truth in poetry than there is in history or something like that. So I think that there could be something like that going on. I'm open to that. I'm certainly not open to the Gnostic thing of just butchering the Old and New Testament together. The Gnostics kind of have to do really what Muslims do, where they just kind of pick and choose what they think works for them. And then if it doesn't, they just ignore it. So I just don't think that that's a valid way of doing these things.